In conversation with Ian, we also recognized the overlap between the previous topic that I was given on white privilege, and I'd added the concept of whiteness and racism. So this is a sequel to the first presentation. And I've already explained the angle that I'm taking, that I am by training and outlook a practical theologian. And I also recognize the fact that there was a sermon, and therefore I will not sermonize. And it is just to buttress the Sunday sermon. I was lucky the previous time that I was able to listen, and we'll see how it goes. The previous one I listened and I read the sermon notes. This one I did not. And so wherever there is some form of overlap, it would be because I was not privileged to that. The idea this evening is to allow more time. I got carried away last time I made that confession to Ian. Today is just to plant seeds and that we have conversation. And I appreciate the fact that we are aware these are difficult conversations and that there will be disagreement, that we bring who we are, uncomfortable as that may be, as we seek to be. The series is titled The Elephant in the Room Conversations. But in my upbringing, and I again lift up front that I was an activist, we looked and called racism a demon. A demon in political activism, but that was a theological, spiritual concept because we believed that it is something that needs to be exorcised. And who best to exorcise the demon of racism than the church? And I've subtitled the presentation with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the African-American intellectuals. For some funny reason, my sources, and in shaping and accentuating and embellishing my presentation, have been African-Americans who have written extensively on the issue of racism, but I've tried to reappropriate it for our context. And Du Bois writes in 1903 already that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. That if there is anything that we are going to grapple with in the 20th, and we are already in the 21st, and this continues to rear its head even today. As I usually do, I always am conscious of the time at which we meet. We meet in September, which is Heritage Day, a day that Heritage Month, and we celebrate it on Monday, Heritage Day, a project of the democratic government to work towards social cohesion and nation building in our country, to recognize the diversity that Ian was praying about, that we are different strands that needs to weave a tapestry called the South African nation. And that through Heritage Month, we bring who we are and we donate to the big collective in terms of our languages, food, dress, songs, dances, and all other elements that make our heritage. And as we celebrate this heritage, we also recognize in truth and honesty that we have a divided heritage. Divided heritage, there are certain things that some people celebrate, and as they celebrate them, they are pain and hurt to the others. You just need to be around that little corner of the Voortrekker Hoogte monument and across the Freedom Park around December 16 to see the contrast of where people celebrate the Voortrekker history and what it is, the pride they have about it, and as they celebrate that Afrikanerdom, which makes them who they are, that history that they celebrate is a history of pain to others. And we have this challenge, and it is, if you visit the two precincts, they are put together in such a way that they are even in silence, dialogue between the two of them in terms of where we come from and while the Afrikaners would look at Freedom Park and look at, black people look at it as a monument of resistance, of pride that has ushered the liberation we have. Others look at it in not so unhappy terms. Also recognizing the time in which we are, this year, 2018, marks the 500th anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade. There's different argument around whether it was on the 18th or on the 28th, but it was 10 days apart in August 1518 that the Spanish King Charles I signed a charter giving permissions to Africans to be sold to the Americas. Before then, African slaves were sent to Europe, to Portugal, to other countries, and Spain. But in 1518, 500 years ago, permission was. So you had black slaves sent to the US, to the Caribbeans, and those islands there. And it is a trade that took the span of 350 years. Where 11 million black people were transported, and about 2 million of them died en route to the Americas. This legacy is a legacy of racism. It's a legacy of pain, of dehumanization, of poverty, and spiritual damage. You can't talk about racism and it becomes just an airy-fairy abstract concept. It has a real impact whose legacy is that of pain. You can imagine 500 years and the vestiges of that repeat themselves. When we saw what is happening in Libya, where there is new form of slavery, where people are literally being sold, you would think that we have outgrown that, but it is here with us. And I want to posit that history, that heritage is of pain, is of bottled emotions and of anger that sometimes burst out in different ways. The Institute of Justice and Reconciliation has shown through research. It's an institution in Cape Town. It was started by a former Methodist minister, Professor Charles Villavicencio, who, after working for the TRC as the chief researcher, went on to establish this institute. They undertake every year what they call the South African Reconciliation Barometer. That barometer shows that there is an appetite among South Africans to work for reconciliation, to work for unity, but indeed that social identity is one of the things after language that is important in this barometer. The issue of race always rears its head as something that needs attention. That research points out, if I were to quote, that the lived experience of unjust and unequal economic and political relations prove to be a hindrance in the way meaningful reconciliation can take place in South Africa. You'd remember that my point of departure is that whiteness, white privilege, racism are not just isolated individual positions, but that they can be structural and systemic in nature. And so even as people seek to be reconciled, the manifestation, the legacy of apartheid as it manifests itself in power relations, especially in the economic, says the barometer, is a hindrance that we need to deal with. You and I are aware of what I call catalog events of racism and how they have manifested themselves recently in South Africa. Whether you talk about the gentleman, the farmer, who together with his laborers threw another laborer into a lion's den and somebody in Palabora was devoured by lions. Whether you talk about the black farmer around Telton near Krugersdorp who was shot by the security guy because he took the tractor and went for lunch. And just for going for lunch, the security guy killed. The incident of the students at UF's, the story of around Middleburg of the two farmers who took a black young man and put him in the coffin, the notorious Penny Sparrow, who likened black people to monkeys when he saw them at the beach and could not fathom that they could share the beach, which had been exclusive of white privilege. Vicky Momberg, who funny abused and used the K word 40 times, responding to police officers who had come to help her, and yet to out the anger on those that tried. There is also this, and I conveniently did not go and try and find his name because I don't think I could waste my time. This white guy who went to a beach and found no black people and took a picture and was so happy that there was not a single K person on the beach and sent to the family. Now there is this one who, because you would think that racism is targeted at some poor, struggling black people. But when somebody has the audacity to call President Cyril Ramaphosa by a K word, you know they are daring. They are challenging for us as black people, one who is the epitome of black progress and success, basically showing you the middle finger that even that which you want to celebrate, we can dehumanize and bring down. So this catalog shows that there is the continued rearing of the head of this demon called racism. Usually when there are discussions about racism, there is this vexing question: can all people be racist? Because most of the time, the focus seems to be on white racism. And my response generally is always, yes, it is possible. But then we can talk about the issues of probability. Probability, because there's a difference between possibility and probable. All of us as human beings can be racist. But what is the fraction? What is the probability? Because the international definition of racism talks about two concepts, and I found the third one today. The dominant one is that where there is racism, there is racial prejudice. But all of us can have racial prejudice. The madam a white madam at home can have racial prejudice about the help, about the maid. The same, the maid, the helper can have a view, can look at the madam and say, sis, this thing, and call whatever and harbor. But prejudice is the first step. Racism is when you add the issue of power to it. Because the one who has power, the one who pays, the one who controls, the one who can fire, can act out their behavior, and this is the third element. So I can have prejudice, I can have views about white people, that it is another thing. Because racism has to have an element of practice, of behavior. It has to be expressed. It is one thing for me to hold it in the private and have views. But once I go out and express it like the catalog of people that I have spoken about, it becomes another thing. Related to racism, when you really, really want to accentuate it, it is the whole notion of the ideology of white supremacy. When it is not held in private, but it is practiced, and I will talk about what I call the continuum of racism just now. But what is difficult about racism, and particularly, and it's important for us as a community of faith to look at, is again one concept that I only learned later this afternoon, what one writer, Barbara Trepnier, calls silent racism. What do we generally call it? It's subtle. It is something to deal with somebody who tells you in their face what they think of you and tell you where to get off. But when it gets subtle and it is expressed and you can't point it out, it becomes so difficult. It is like when somebody is pinching you and you're going, but you can't express and explain exactly what is it that is happening. you experience it. And a colleague of mine, a former colleague, Wiseman Magasela, and I want to send that a piece that he has written to you, and so that you can share it on WhatsApp or whatever, writes about racism in the workplace, where even black intellectuals, professionals are forever seen as those who have not yet made it, even in institutions of higher learning. You can hear about stories of well-qualified professors who are struggling to relate even to those that are junior in them, despite reaching the zenith of what it means to be intellectual. So it can be systematic. We know violence to always be physical, but we have learned, particularly from gender-based violence, that abuse can be very subtle, can be intangible, cannot be expressed physically. And sometimes that is the one that is difficult to prove. If you go to the US, you know the story of the lynching, of how black people were lynched. What did they call it? The Jim Crow laws. What again in South Africa we call apartheid laws, and I spoke about them last time, and how they manifested themselves. All these were designed to oppress, to exploit, and to dehumanize, and I want to emphasize that point. And part of this challenge that I have today is that when you talk about people who were oppressed, we have new concepts that are, for me, very accommodative. If you go to work where I work, we talk about previously disadvantaged people. Dilute exactly. Instead of saying previously oppressed, previously exploited, those words have been sanitized, and we talk about people previously disadvantaged. The other point on the continuum of racism, I've already spoken about racial prejudice as something that can be privately owned, and that racism does include power and power structures that reinforce it. It is one thing to have a racial outlook, but if you work, for instance, you are a farmer and you have this institution, the economics that are behind you to express this racial prejudice, it becomes something. The other notion is of liberalism, which is generally about how you can have conservative white people who are, in our language, people as a problem that they need to be sorted out. They are not worth it, whether it is about beauty, outlooks, whether it is about intelligence, whether it is about morals. They hold a low view of people of other races. But liberals, on the other hand, are those who have paternalistic ways. They look at black people, they want to get along black people, they'll always remind you that they have black friends, but sometimes they look at black people as these people who needs to be helped to reach white standards. They need to be groomed. That's one concept I learned on how etiquette and how there's a movie I've forgotten, something rabbit, in Australia, where the Aborigines were taken to a camp, to schools, young ones to be taught how to be white, so that they can fit the standards of what it means to be appropriate. But progressives, for me, are those who acknowledge that black people are fully human, with capacities and capabilities similar to those of their white counterparts. Those are those who are committed to fully change and reverse the culture of racism wherever it raises its head. Institutional racism, I spoke about it, and I want to move forward. Then there is the issue of racism in the church. I recently retrieved from my library a book written by a Methodist minister, Darrell Balia. The book is titled Black Methodist and White Supremacy in South Africa. For me, that book remains a seminal book in documenting racism in the church, particularly in the Methodist Church. I argued during the time of the TRC, when other sectors of society were going to the TRC and the church was not there, that the church is not being honest in terms of its legacy and history, not to go there and confess and model to others how to confess and deal with the history of where we come from. In that book, I only want to remind us and quote in the preface written by Professor Lizo Jafta, one of our eminent black church historians. He writes about the story of the former president, what we now call presiding bishop, Alex Boraine. Many of you know Alex Boraine, who went on to find the Progressive Federal Party. Who went to B.J. Foster at that time to coerce the church to advocate for freedom and liberation for black people. And B.J. Foster, as the prime minister, had done his homework in intelligence. And as they were talking, he sat there reclining and listened to them and pretended not to understand who they are and asked those who were, by the way, what church is this? Methodist. And oh, Methodist. Please tell me about how these things that you are preaching to me, how they manifest themselves in your church. And he had done his homework. And truth is that at that time, the Methodist Church was racist. There used to be two synods. A black synod would sit first. They would deliberate, ministers, make decisions. The white synod would follow. Whatever decisions were made in the black synod would be taken to the white one, and the white one had the right to veto whatever these black okies had talked about. The stipends were different, a number of even training was different. And it was so embarrassing for the church to be able to go and want to preach that which we could not model. So it is very important for us that last time a gentleman confronted our former Bishop VT, a white general who, when VT as bishop was talking about transformation in the church, went to the bishop and said, "Bishop, please give us a break. It is at work we're talking transformation. It is in sport we are talking transformation. My wife is teaching at a university. The church is a place where we are trying to run to, and we are hoping not to get this politics." And truth is that sometimes we even use our spirituality, including prayer, as an anesthetic to dealing with issues. There are situations where there are tensions. People will not engage in a conversation similar to the one you are having, and they will immediately say, "Let us pray." And that prayer is meant to sanitize. It serves as what I call anesthetic that make people not deal with this. I want to stop my presentation as cut it for conversation. But I want to talk about black nihilism. Black nihilism, what Cornel West, again, that intellectual in the US, talks about. Nihilism, philosophers will tell you, it's about meaninglessness. You know, when you are unemployed and you go and try to find work and there is no hope, you lose hope, you have alienation. You look at systems, you are powerless. You look at yourself, you look at this system, they are so big. You are just a small thing in this big scheme of things. You have low self-esteem and self-hatred, even self-destruction. The impact, says Cornel West, of racism is black nihilism, where there are black people who look at themselves, where you even start internalizing that which you are told, that you are not worthy, you are inferior, and you leave it out. And indeed, if racism has been violent, we cannot be surprised by the level of violence that are in black communities as they express themselves. Because truth is that black people were not born violent. We need research to talk about the damage of apartheid, or whether you go to the US, of what this oppression has done. And he concludes by writing, and I want to quote him, that the frightening result of this nihilism is a numbing detachment from others of self-destructive disposition towards the world, where life is without meaning, is without hope, and love breeds a cold hatred, mean-spirited outlook, and seeks to destroy the self and other individuals. You just do not care. You are just numb to life because you have made a thing. The April 2018 issue, and I had wanted to bring the copy of the National Geographic, the magazine, was a special edition on racism. And what I love about what this magazine did, they took a researcher and gave the researcher to look for over 100 years of the existence of the magazine, to look at how racism manifested itself in their magazine. And they took a photographer, somebody who was a specialist in photography, and they went and did the research. And one of the things that showed Geographic had no pictures of black people doing something that is right, what I talked about last time as erasure. And where black people only appeared, it was where they were poor, they were struggling, or they were doing things that are not worthy. They were caricaturing black leaders on the African continent and in the diaspora. Why I like what they did is they were able to write, when you do self-introspection, you look at yourself, you evaluate yourself, you critique yourself, and having done that, you are able to stand on a moral high ground and be able to critique others. What I love about that is that they also took the scientific route of dealing with racism, because racism is not scientific. The picture outside, and if you can Google it, is of this family. It's a biracial couple, a black man and a white woman who married and had twins. I don't know if you saw that. And the twins are different. They are what are similar twins called? They are identical twins in everything except color. The one is black and the other one is white, but they look exactly the same. And the writer of the article throws the spanner in the wheel around those who hold racial views, to prove again that it is a complex scientific thing around genetics. There is other scientific information that I dealt with. I just want to skip that and rush to what I call black consciousness as an antidote of racism. I would not end here without talking about black consciousness. Black consciousness, as articulated by Steve Biko and his comrades, was designed to counter white racism. It was designed to affirm, empower black people. The slogan was, "Black is beautiful." When others are preaching and telling you to the point of almost believing that you are ugly and not worthy, its mantra was that the black is beautiful. It was during the time of the 70s and the 60s where kinky hair became fashionable, where Afro was appreciated, where dreadlocks started flowing, and even those in the industry started calling people like Naomi Campbell, and all of a sudden, they appeared beautiful, when history and heritage had told us that they were not beautiful. Black consciousness was advanced as a form through which black people can assert themselves and resist racism. It is what another woman, black intellectual in America, Bell Hooks, calls the element of race. You don't just resist and negotiate and want to be nice when pain is inflicted to you. Talks about this rage, what theologians called righteous anger. That is sometimes when somebody is trapping on your toes, that you can't negotiate and say, my foot has gone under your foot. That you need to be so assertive and tell the person where to get off because they are dominating and oppressing you. Close to black consciousness was black theology of liberation. as advanced by James Cone, our own Itumeleng Mosala, Takatso Mofokeng, our own Kozam Gojo, Stanley Mohoba, and others, rooted in the theory and philosophy of Malcolm X and Steve Biko and Martin Luther King and Frantz Fanon, amongst others, where it sought to demystify, to debunk, and demystify the whole notion of white theology that used God to legitimate the segregation and black oppression of black people. We know the history of apartheid, as I argued last time, was advanced by Afrikaner theologians, and Stellenbosch became the hub, or even Verwoerd, if I'm mistaken, was a theologian who coined this thing, this whole concept of predestination and Afrikaners as the elect, those who have been elected by God to be models, to be those who are showing black people what it means to be. We know the portrayal of Jesus in the movies and in the pictures. It's ingrained in our psyche that it is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man who always play the role of Jesus. And black theology helped us understand that even black people are created in God's image. And sermons had to be preached around that so that we are able to address this problem. Ian had written a slide around interventions, around what I believe should be the church's role around conducting anti-bias, and I recommend Alan Story as one of those who deal with good programs around what you are doing in terms of preaching, the dialogue and conversations that we are having here. In conclusion, I want to conclude with a quote from Booker T. Washington. And this is very important. And with this, I want to affirm you as Westview in terms of what you are doing. He wrote, "When you hold me down in this ditch, you too remain in the same ditch. If you want to oppress me and keep me as low, I can't be low alone. You come to my level. And if you throw me into the ditch, the only way you can keep me in that ditch, in that inferiority, in that level of hatred and of exploitation and dehumanization, is to come with me in the ditch." So we have the choice. Either we remain in the ditch together, or we lift each other up as brothers and sisters. And as Paul would say, neither Jew nor Greek, neither woman or man. I thank you for the opportunity to address you. Thank you.